Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards Ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam, and I'm joined by Pooka today. Pooka, are you ready for another tome of magic?
I am. I'm feeling both forbidden and or forgotten.
Okay, well, you can't get better than that. Before we get into it, probably got some announcements. We've got a very active Mage community, so Pooka, can you think of any announcements?
I have an important one, assuming this episode drops before the second week of June. I'd like to encourage all listeners to check out TryItCon 2, TerryCon Edition. So this is the follow-up of an online convention held in 2021 and conceived by our friend Terry Robinson to get people to try new games. In his memory, we'll be holding the second iteration on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of June. It will be entirely online through Zoom and Discord. It's $20 that'll go to charity, and you can find out all the information and updates at tryitcon.com. We especially need some GMs to run games, so even if it's your first time doing so, or you're running a system you've never tried before, this is the perfect opportunity. So please reach out if you have any questions, and we hope very much to see you there.
Thanks, that does sound like a lot of fun. Well, TL Webb stated it will be a month or so until episode 7 of Darkness Over Dallas Night Rangers is ready for publication. This is a fiction series. The Night Rangers are a technocratic amalgam operating out of the Texas Rangers, which gives them vast control over police and law assets all over Texas, and then they also have hypertech. Patrick J. is almost ready to publish his next Storyteller's Vault project, Task Force Wotan, a supplement to run a chronicle starting right after Code Ragnarok, where the troupe plays high-level technocrats assigned to study vampires in hopes of finding and destroying other antediluvians. The players may also play several hapless frontline assets that their technocrat characters send into the line of fire, confound vampire organizations through a macro-level minigame, and justify their actions and resource allocations through a cutthroat routine process of peer review to maintain their positions and authority. Well, that wraps up the announcements, everybody. Today we discuss Forbidden and Forgotten Orders, which covers the crafts of the Disparate Alliance. The Disparate Alliance is a new faction in Mage 20 that stands apart from the Council of Nine and the Technocracy. The name, Disparate Alliance, is like saying, Loners Unite! I can imagine the letters that were sent out to get it started. Hey, have you been an independent group for hundreds of years, doing your own thing, going your own way? Well, great! Join our faction. All joking aside, the assumption is somewhere after 2010, 3 or 4 of the crafts decided they would always be subject to the will of the large factions like the Council of Nine or the Technocracy. So they talked to other crafts, and they said, let's seek strength in numbers. The Disparate Alliance was the result, and somehow they have managed to keep it a secret from the larger mage factions. Faces of Magic and Forbidden and Forgotten Orders were released at the same time. They are the final books for Mage 20. Mage 20 may resume in the future, but for now there are no more books planned. Forbidden and Forgotten Orders is a rather long and unwieldy title. Satiros Brucato said in an interview there were several shorter titles suggested for the book, but the intellectual property holder for Mage the Ascension turned down every suggestion before accepting the current title. Several Mage fans have said they would like to have seen more than 9 pages given to each craft, but the IP holder required a low page count. The cover depicts a woman in armor with sword and shield facing down opponents with swords. Can someone tell me what fighting style trains people to hold shields that way? I don't even understand how her arm can be long enough to hold it that way. My shoulder hurts just looking at this illustration. Pooka, please tell me you paid attention to the cover. What's going on there?
I certainly paid attention to it. I cannot give you a coherent description for whatever stance any of the people involved is holding, including the implicit person whose viewpoint we're looking from. They've got like one sword facing up and out, the other down, pointing towards themselves. I'm not really sure what's going on there.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we can have another round of interviews and find out just what is going on with that cover, but it is certainly evocative. I will give it that. Before we get into the book, I wanted to cover the game term craft. It is often found in the Mage books with a capital C. I try to keep clear definitions of all but the most mystical game terms for my players. An orphan group is a group formed by orphan mages. These groups don't yet have clear rules on who they recruit, how they train those recruits, and how they define their approach to magic. The Hollow Ones were an orphan group in 1st and early 2nd edition. A craft is an independent group of mages who have been around for a while and have a clear understanding of recruiting, training. They know how to do their magic. Mage 20 has a very loose definition of the word craft. Basically, any mage group that is not a part of Technocracy, Council of Nine, Marauders, or Nefandi is a craft. Mage 20 has no notion of orphan group, at least I haven't seen that term anywhere in the Mage 20 books. We'd like to offer our listeners a walkthrough of Mage books, but like Lore of the Traditions, this book has little structure beyond a chapter for each Mage group. It starts off with an introduction. 4.5 pages gives us future fates. These are ideas to what might be going on in the Disparate Alliance and where they might be going. 7 headers like Fallen Technocracy and Nephandic Pawns give a few possibilities for the crafts, dealing with a technocracy that has gone rotten or the Nephandi manipulating the crafts. Most of the suggestions are yes, no, and maybe, with a few sentences behind them. I found the material in the Future Fate section so vague in general that I didn't think it helpful. Next up is 2 pages on crafts that didn't join the Disparate Alliance. This was interesting. 8 crafts are mentioned briefly, some updates of note. The Itsutsugama, the high-tech ninjas introduced in Revised Edition, were revealed to be a nothing burger. They shrunk down to a fat middle-aged man who people snicker at. Well, that sucked. I like the original idea more. Mirai no Men looks like a very interesting group. The name translates into Future No Drama Men or Future Dramatic Noodles. Take your pick. Their nickname is the Future Masks. They are a group of mages who have embraced the digital web and its related technologies so strongly that even the virtual adepts can't understand them. Each mage in the group appears and behaves differently each time they are encountered, making them a very difficult group to interact with. I see them as a new group of mages that have found a powerful set of techniques that could soon lead to trouble. A sort of chaos magic tied to a fluid sense of self. The trouble is you fracture your identity and either tilt too close to being a marauder or suffer a breakdown. I'm eager to use them as an NPC group in my games. I'll bet marauders in Nephandi are eager to use them too. The Harbingers of Avalon have produced a splinter group called the Navalon Knights. They create high-tech wonders that look like swords, shields, and suits of medieval armor. They are so tied to outdated weapons and tactics that I don't think they fit Mage 20's setting very well. Also, too much overlap with the Templar Knights. Finally, we have the Thunder Society. This group is led by Zoka, a signature character from Revised Edition that was a dream speaker. In Mage 20, Zoka left the traditions to start the Thunder Society, which has a lot of members and resources. They are poised to shake up the world of Mage. When I look at Mage 20 and consider what is most believable, I see the Thunder Society poaching a lot of members from the Disparate Alliance. I think the Disparate Alliance would be pressured to respond. It seems likely that when the leaders of the Disparates are planning their first big project, they will be derailed to deal with the Thunder Society. Well, that's the introduction. Pooka, what are your thoughts on the intro?
Oh, I have thoughts. So with the Future Fates in particular, as someone who doesn't really use metaplot that much, I found it mostly unhelpful. About the only directly relevant one to one of my games was the last one, I think. And I guess the other crafts that didn't make the cut, like, I wish I had given firmer reasons for why they didn't join. I guess this is also semi-useful as metaplot explanation, but it makes me curious about how those conversations went, like whether or not they were approached. As a sidebar, I didn't really care much about the Mirai no Men until you suggested Future Dramatic Noodles as a possible translation, and now that's the mage I need in my world. What wasn't clear from this introduction was whether the book would provide any detail about coordination at the level of the Alliance as a whole. The extent of what we get here is the groups consider each other equal, and I'm thinking, do they though? They have their populations and cultures that they alone protect, which raises the question of what happens when there are subjects from more than one protected culture. They form personal alliances and they cooperate. This book points to Book of Secrets for a deeper dive, but that book's Disparate section is like entirely centered on crime and punishment within the group, and I wanted to know more about how do they even get together to hash out their legal code? What do non-legal code meetings look like? What do joint missions look like? I don't know that they wanted to provide concrete answers. The book underscores that these crafts generally leave each other alone until necessary, so it's hard to see them as more than just a mutual defense pact. But they certainly have opinions about the overall alliance and about each other, which we get from each craft's perspective. It's hard to see the necessity of labeling them a group or seeing how to integrate them as a group into a game without more stuff to work with. So overall, this isn't really a holistic guide to the crafts or crafts reloaded. It's basically 11 little craft books all in a row.
Well, after the introduction, the book has 11 chapters, no appendix. Each craft in the Disparate Alliance gets a chapter plus one for orphans. The 11 chapters are placed in 3 sections called the Forerunners, Middlers, and Outsiders. The Ngoma, Templars, Taftani, and Hollow Ones are Forerunners. Ahl-i-Batin, Kahu, Sisters of Hippolita, and Wulong are Middlers. Bata, Solificati, and Orphans are the outsiders. The Forerunners organize the Disparate Alliance and are working to make it hold together. The Middlers are in it, but less dedicated. The Outsiders don't have confidence in the Alliance and less participation. I don't think the three classifications help that much. Also, the crafts assigned to the sections rarely make sense. I have a hard time seeing the Taftani and Hollow ones as Forerunners. The Ahl-i-Batin as Middlers just doesn't come together for me. Pooka, what did you think of this notion of three sections or three groups inside the Disparate Alliance?
Completely agreed with what you said, and I was especially frustrated that in the M20 core, we get this note about the 5 groups that kind of germinated the Alliance, and they do not correspond to this breakdown at all. Like, the Solificati and the Bata are said to be some of the founders. I'm like, well then, how are they the outsiders? So it just confounded me a bit. I think, though, it might have been because this book was funded in 3 stages as part of the Kickstarter for Lore of the Traditions, and this was the excuse to divide them up into 1, 2, 3 or something.
Oh, that's probably the key right there. I did not know that. Thanks for sharing that. That's starting to crystallize for me now. Well, our first craft is the Ngoma. The Ngoma started in Sorcerer's Crusade, where it's stated they died out in the 1500s. Revised edition decided they didn't die out. They were just keeping quiet for tax purposes. I thought of them as an African Order of Hermes. I had no particular interest in them until I read this chapter. This chapter gave them a personality and focus that makes me want to use them in games. I interviewed the author for the podcast, and I'm glad I did. Page 21 states, "The Ngoma have reestablished the kingdom of Kush as their seat of power in the enlightened world," end quote. And I was thinking, so what does that mean? Turns out that means they have a chantry in Sudan, Africa, with a lot of resources behind it. It would have been so nice to hear more about that chantry. This chapter gives us a craft that focuses on leadership, organizing, and diplomacy among mages. Yes, scholarship and studying magic is important to them, but they are not another Order of Hermes. Creating something like the Disparate Alliance is something the Ngoma would do. If I had a player with a Ngoma mage in one of my games, there would be NPCs approaching the player with strong encouragements to form a new group or be an envoy on behalf of the Ngoma to another mage group. Now, why the Ngoma remained solitary and quiet for centuries no longer makes sense, but I'm willing to work around that. Pride is a problem for this craft. They have been leaders and accomplished mages for so many centuries they see their ideas as the only ones worth discussing. This pride makes sense and gives them an added dimension I want to explore. The chapter mentions some Ngoma are still inside the Order of Hermes, but doesn't make the relationship clear between the two groups of Ngoma. My interview with the author of this chapter indicated she thought the Ngoma will open an invitation to their brothers and sisters inside the Order of Hermes. Leave the Hermetics and join us. If you don't, stop calling yourselves Ngoma. You aren't us. We learn the Ngoma want the Order of Hermes to admit they learned much from the ancient Ngo-Ami of Africa. First I've heard of this. Do they have any proof? The Ngoma are also upset the Hermetics got their original magical lore from raiding Ngoma libraries centuries ago. I've read all the mage books that precede this one, and I've never seen this before. Lore of the Traditions was the place to write about the Order of Hermes. This chapter is for material on the Ngoma. We also learned the Hermetics didn't understand the magic they learned from Africa and made lots of mistakes, releasing spirits, accidental curses, and other magical messes. Again, these claims of incompetence for the Hermetics are new to me. The Hermetics have used careful study, thorough practice, and comparing notes for centuries. That doesn't produce clueless mages. I think the Ngoma are talking trash they can't back up. Also, this makes Ngoma magic sound more like hedge magic. In hedge magic, the details are everything. In sphere magic, enlightened will is the main thing. There are details, but they are less critical. Honor and thanks is a ritual that gives a -1 on spirit and prime difficulties for a quick gesture. It sounds nice, but it's too easy, a little too powerful for my games. Pooka, what is your take on the Ngoma chapter?
Well, first of all, I'm always in favor of librarian mages, so more of them, please. And with this chapter, the foundational piece is this notion of gathering a library of knowledge that has been stolen and scattered, bringing it together piece by orally transmitted piece. And that focus on what such knowledge conveys that a written repository of books can't. I think that makes for a nice contrast with the Hermetics that they have such beef with. As a linguist, I'm also in favor of this key-tongue spirit language as a guiding principle, although more generally, I did feel like I was missing a lexicon. There were lots of italicized and uppercase terms, not all of which have appeared previously in M20, as you said. Given the fluidity of the introduction when it comes to talking about what the Disparate Alliance is doing and how its members interact with each other, I was glad that this first chapter took pains to give comments on the other crafts and on subdivisions within the Ngoma that have differences of opinion about the Alliance's purpose. So I remember in your interview, the author had mentioned the fact that the craft recognizes pride going before the fall with the Hermetics because they've gone through it themselves. So now they're picking up the pieces. That idea of, here's your historic foil, historic with tragic undertones because you had so much in common, but they were dicks, and now they're blindly hurtling towards the same mistake you might have made. Do you mend fences with them to stop a greater evil, like the Technocracy and/or the Nefandi, or do you take the opportunity to reclaim what they stole from you? And the fact that there are those fissures between the ones who joined the Hermetics and those who didn't adds another layer that makes for this nuanced, complicated take on post-colonialism. But the step that I was having difficulty making was getting from paradigm to practice, to use the M20 parlance. The core book gave us some of the bits of their paradigm and a whole range of practices and tools, but very little detail. When I think of the word Ngoma, I think of the drums that carry that name, and which is the icon for the craft, but there's no mention of music or dance here. Ancestor spirits and stories and language all seem to be important pieces, but paradigmatically it's unclear why. Also in your interview, I think there was a mention of string theory as a way to interpret the same principle, so I feel like there's an interesting foundation there to explore. And I remember you also, you had talked with the author about astrology at length, but I didn't see anything about star reading here. And ultimately, one merit and one focus item / ritual doesn't give me a lot to work with. So I would have liked to see more specific notes about the Ngoma in the context of their activities, especially what they're up to in Africa. There are notes in the core book that they have big ideas for the future of their rich and varied continent, and that they are urbane sophisticates, professors and doctors and astrophysicists. But while we get those broad strokes about possible futures they perceive from struggle through to utopia, we don't really get details about what they're planning beyond the cool but rather vaguely sketched out New Kush Initiative and diaspora schools. So how do they apply the knowledge they're recollecting to help communities? Are they founding departments at universities or helping on the Timbuktu Manuscripts Project? How do they navigate the politics of cities where they're based? The way they're described, they feel a little all-purpose as mages, capable of lots of roles, which is great, but I want to see how they put that into action, because that gives me tangible story hooks for a game. So, that's me.
Well, next up we have the Templars, also called the Templar Knights, and the Knights of the Temple of Solomon. Solomonic Knights of Templetown was left out, but I guess 3 different names is good enough for one book. This chapter has 2 illustrations. Both are women in medieval armor. This is the opposite of what the Templars used to be. They started out in 2nd edition as men who used modern weapons and tactics. This chapter introduces a number of changes. The Templars started accepting women and other genders in the 2000s. Revised edition had the Templars who joined the Celestial Chorus accepting women, while the Templars who remained independent did not. Before this book, they were Christians. This book tells us they renounced Christianity in the 1800s in order to become nothing, really. They no longer have any beliefs or doctrine. They are governed by warm, fuzzy feelings. The current Grand Master is Charlotte de la Roe, a woman. This is such a complete transformation for the Templars that it will surprise many. Despite the changes, this chapter is not kind to the Knights. Before the 2000s, they are called a boys-only society. The chapter tells us, quote, "When the Templars were a boys-only club swinging swords at brown people," end quote. The author's contempt for the Templars is pretty clear. Mage has had women-only groups for years, but they never got this treatment. The Templars are now allies of the Ahl-i-Batin. I like this. I think the 2 groups could find some common ground and work well together. Templars know how to make orichalcum, a special metal which has the same game mechanics as Premium. We get orichalcum blades, which are wonders that vary from 1 to 5 points. We don't get any rules for them. It mentions aggravated damage and other enchantments. Looking up Premium in other Mage 20 books will give you information on counter magic. If I had to make a ruling, I would say each point in the wonder gives you 1 die of aggravated damage and gives the wielder 1 die of counter magic while holding the blade. If that's too powerful, choose one of those powers. Pooka, what did you think of the Templar chapter?
So full disclosure, they're probably my least favorite craft to begin with, which is going to color my take on them here, and my impression was not majorly improved by this section. I didn't care for them in Book of Crafts. I was indifferent to their Cabal of Pure Thought Forerunners or Associates or whatever in Sorcerer's Crusade. And their write-up in M20 was ugh. But I'll admit that I did find them slightly more interesting in here than the core book, maybe because they eased up a little on the militia tropes and added some more complexity to the, shall we say, ham-fisted statements about diversity in their ranks and supposed open-minded thinking. I was a little baffled by the opening fiction, but whatever, I rolled with it. So this is maybe going to be a recurring thread in my comments. I didn't necessarily want a rehash of Book of Crafts, but that book had lots to draw on as inspiration, if nothing else. So they did drop in here a system of titles and ranks, as we saw in the older book, which helped give the craft a little more weight and setting. And Orichalcum's nice premium, that's cute. There are at least a few cursory mentions of their attitude towards the Alliance, but I expected more if they were part of the Forerunners. They seem to have specifically jumped in for their technocrat grudge, and that's it. But then even the core book write-up has more stuff about things like the lodges that divide them up, or their use of the internet to coordinate. And those are aspects that are easy to disentangle from the bits that lean hard into the righteous wrath of God angle that they seem to have wanted to move past. They could have even drawn on Sorcerer's Crusade for some of this. Something also that I expected to see more of were meditations on the nature of their faith or their conception of heresy in the context of their evolution through history. If the goal was to give them some more depth, that's a pretty central piece of their identity, maybe even more than it is for the Celestial Chorus. Do they ever question their faith? How do they practice it outside of battle? This would have been a great opportunity to bring in more guidance around using the true faith trait, especially given that it's part of the Knight Captain background that they get here. But even though we get details about that history, there's just kind of this repetition of, we're God's warriors and we're misunderstood, but we don't care, we're going to fight back. Also, we take ladies now. And granted, this is in character, so maybe those sort of blind spots are telling. There's also the thing about, well, we fought the Ahl-i-Batin in the Crusades, but we're friends now. And that's the kind of glossing over of issues that a Templar would indeed make. I liked the amount of self-awareness that did come through, but only because we really didn't see any of that in the core book. And the fact that we got so many words about the pearl clutching around this signature character Charlotte, rather than any development on their focus, a section that doesn't substantively expand on the few sentences in their core book write-up, that to me is a missed opportunity. I think missed opportunity is a phrase I could utter a lot with this book. So.
Well, we turn now to the Taftani. Revised edition made me love these guys, but they started out in Sorcerer's Crusade Companion. They were a craft in the Middle Ages in the Renaissance era that was wiped out by Paradox before the modern era began. Revised edition decided they were too tough for Paradox. I can see a leather jacket with a message on the back. I don't worry about Paradox. Paradox worries about me. This chapter makes several changes to the Taftani to equip them to spread out across the globe. I can get behind the changes. They make sense to me. The changes come at the expense of softening the craft's hardcore image, but survival and adaptation are never easy. This chapter repudiates the Taliban connection. In Revised Edition, they worked with the sleepers in the Taliban. Now they have rethought that and no longer associate with the Taliban. I can see that. The Taftani realized satellites circle the globe and observe the remote areas of the Middle East. This made them rethink their policy of hiding out in desert and mountainous areas. They spread across the globe and in the process had to soften their notion of challenging Paradox head-on. As they spread out, they found countless opportunities to recruit new members and increase their influence. These are big changes, but like I said, they actually work for me. What didn't work for me was the mention of the Taftani's willingness to rapidly pick up modern technology and love the internet. I think that changes them in a way that reduces their character and appeal. The external relations section is pretty useless. It's just random observations of other mage groups with nothing interesting. This chapter had very little mention of controlling spirits, which left a lot on the table. What makes a craft unique should not be overlooked. I think the Taftani representative to the Disparate Alliance would have a terrible time. The rep would want to pass on what he or she learned to other Taftani, while the others would just want other mages to support Taftani projects. The Paradox mitigation merit is a bad idea, in my opinion. The Taftani are a great opportunity to focus on challenging the consensus in your games. Don't throw that away with the Paradox immunity merit. Djinn expertise is a good merit for a player new to Mage. It allows the storyteller to help them out dealing with Djinn spirits. Don't let experienced players exploit this. Obvious resonance is a good flaw, makes sense for Taftani. Devouring Gullet of Flame is a cool Forces effect. It creates an inferno and then sucks people into it. If you use this on politicians, you get extra experience points. Pooka, did the Taftani intimidate you? What did you think?
Oh, I went into this one with excitement and apprehension in equal measure because they are one of my favorite crafts. They're just so over the top and I love it. Plus they have comparatively a lot of words already written about them, so there was a lot to live up to and also mess up. People have also commented on how different they are in M20 conceptually, but I'd prefer to think they've just wised up and gotten more careful about how flashy they are, and I say this chapter bears that out. Structurally, I think this is pretty close to what I was hoping for in each section, content aside. So there's 1 page of fiction that's flavorful and vibrant. The 3 pages of history are comprehensive. Their story does swirl around the Ahl-i-Batin a lot, but the two are rather intertwined in the canon, so I guess it makes sense, at least more than talking about clashes with the Hermetics before I think the Order even came together in 767 or whatever it was. The one thing that still doesn't quite align for me is their power base in Dubai, because the art and architecture of that city is a very surface level read of what that city is. And I think it would be hard to do their not quite hiding in plain sight thing and undermining the enemy from the inside living there. So I wish there'd been more with the throwaway mention about their presence on the digital web, or as a throwback to Lost Paths, something about their presence in the US. If they can tolerate the Syndicate in Dubai, they must be partying with the ecstatics at Burning Man, right? That was my thought. Some of that bleeds into the page we get on their overall ethos, which, as you said, points more to their history as crafters rather than as gin binders, and says that their newfound subtlety is partly out of respect for their presence in the Alliance. It's a choice. It's a choice that not everyone is going to be happy with, but if it helps bring them more into the setting and gives more options to integrate them into a story, I'm okay with it. And then a few paragraphs on factions, a few paragraphs on possible fates, a few paragraphs of opinions on other groups, and a few character concepts. We have merits and flaws and multiple rotes, and all of this fits snugly into 8 pages. If I could change one thing about the structure of this, apart from just adding more pages, I would say the history could be condensed a bit to make room for more about their focus and faith, because things like Asha and Druj and how they inform the actual working of magic could benefit from more explanation to the reader. A little more about the groups they recruit from and the relationship with the Jinn, more about what the modern apprenticeship looks like and the projects they have apart from, let's do a massive Vulgar with Witnesses effect. All of that would have been nice to see. The limited space means that the table has to do a lot of heavy lifting, but 90% of this is what I wanted to see from the template. Maybe the toughest thing about them has always been that they fly in the face of the conventions of the secret world genre. They were Vulgar with Witnesses on 2 legs. So now that they've been tempered somewhat, bit of a letdown though that is, and Paradox is less toothy than it used to be, they are easier to present as functional mages within the world of the game. And whether you want to accept their recasting from fiercely individualistic Paradox bombs to crafty bravos who know that discretion is the better part of awesome, well, that's each table's choice.
Well put. Did we forget about the Hollow Ones? We'd better not. They might get resentful. Too late. Their chapter in this book makes it clear they are indeed resentful. Their chapter opens with, "The poet will be discontented even in the streets of heaven. The poet is always in revolt." Thank you, G.K. Chesterton. He nailed it more than 60 years before the Hollow Ones were created. The opening fiction gives us a New World Order agent following a Hollow One into a nightclub. The agent is discovered and captured. The Hollow One then proceeds to lecture the agent. The Mage 20 rulebook mentions Room 101, where the New World Order brainwashes people. If given a choice between Room 101 and this lecture, I might choose Room 101. It's a tough call. The character speaking throughout this chapter is a perfect example of why tradition mages don't always like Hollow Ones. I'm not going to say he's annoying, but I will say this. Void engineers have airlocks on their shuttles made for this guy. The lecture mentions paradigm so much it stands out in this book. The problem is the Hollow One is talking about practice more than paradigm. Mixing random odds and ends can pass for practice, but never paradigm. When describing how Hollow Ones use ideas from various magical systems, the speaker gets concerned about cultural appropriation. Explains it away by saying the difference between appropriation and adaptation is whether you punched down or up. What the hell? This is a thoroughly subjective statement. What is really being expressed here is, my friends and I can do it, you can't. A statement worth making here. The speaker describes how it isn't proper to mix things together without a proper appreciation. But if mixing together odds and ends works, taking the time to properly appreciate it is nothing more than sentiment. Also, if it works, there are no paradigms in the game. Paradigm means if the mage has no framework to understand what they're doing, they can't do it. I got off on a tangent. We mage fans can't resist arguments about paradigm. All right, moving on. The Hollow Ones have two opinion groups that aren't internal factions. The counselors want to cooperate with the Council of Nine and be accepted. Revolutionaries want to avoid non-Hollow One mages, but make alliances with other supernatural beings as they see fit. I doubt they realize how easily they could be manipulated by vampires or changelings. When the chapter started, I thought cliques was the Hollow One term for cabals, but they are 5 informal groups inside the craft. Incognitos, planners and thinkers who make strategies and pass them on to others. Soundwave masters hold public events that only those in the know can find. They play music, have a festival or something similar, where news is passed back and forth with subtlety. Activists attack enemies of the craft and inspire sleepers to do likewise. They work to make their activities look like protests. Moles, as in the kind of rodent that burrows underground. Moles are infiltrators in the Technocracy and Council of Nine. They pass secrets to other Hollow Ones. Finally, we have the Masters. This group isn't explained well. It seems to be Hollow Ones who consider themselves experienced and capable. Anarchist Braggart is a 1-point flaw. The flaw is you're a jerk, but the write-up tells you not to be a jerk. How is this flaw handled? Folks, you'll have to work that one out on your own. Riding the Rails is a good example of a rote that dovetails with other rotes to establish a network between mages. It allows the caster to understand circumstances at the next location in the network and travel there quietly and quickly. Many mage factions would set up something like this, so I'm glad it's here. I just wish they had included the accompanying rote to connect a place to this network. Pooka, you're looking dour. I think you're ready to comment on this chapter.
I have applied sufficient eyeliner to make comments. So, obviously, this was going to be the biggest vibe of they could have done so much more, given how the Hollow Ones have more text about them out there than any of the other groups in here. And I also felt like, well, the possible fates thing in the introduction had, I think, 3 separate things about the Hollow Ones in the metaplot, so no doubt that'll be in there again. But especially as a raver/clubber who's dabbled in subculture studies, I see a lot of potential in them that 8 or 9 pages can never hope to contain. So, the Hollow Ones, I mean, they've been reinvented a few times across editions, which, okay, if any group is going to suffer through that, it should be them. So maybe the bit in here that says, ask 3 Hollow Ones where they came from, and you'll get 2 answers and 7 theories, that's a nod to that. They folded Victorian spiritualism, interwar libertinism, post-war nihilism, and nephantic associations all in there as options. But a regular issue with M20 is trying to have it all ways, establishing a new precedent in the core book material while still incorporating or acknowledging or even just winking at the various precedents that came before. So if you're a new player who only has the 2-page spread in M20 core to go on, you would think that the Hollow Ones are chaos magician artists, music nerds to be precise, solidly grown out of 19th century decadent sensibilities. Adding in all these other tilts which point to things like their revised tradition book or even Victorian Mage without enough space for context is just going to be confusing. And I worry that a storyteller's default reply to that will be, chaos magic, and some waving of hands. The narrator actually does an okay in-character articulation of one species of chaos magic, but yeah, that discussion of paradigm kind of gets lost in the shuffle of the multiple choice history that we get at the same time. In terms of writing style, it had this balance of the M20 voice that's focused on mages as activists, the high melodrama that I'd expect from an in-character Hollow One, and an implied frame narrative which, on the one hand, I was thinking, why would this character be info-dumping to a technocrat agent? And on the other, I replied to myself, White Wolf! The 3 sample futures that we get in each chapter were indeed replaced by those Hollower-centered metaplot notes from the start, as expected, which felt a little lacking. Given how the Disparate Alliance itself barely gets a mention in this section, I might have liked something about how the Hollow Ones helped take the lead by pointing to their approach to magic as inspiration for what the crafts politely educating each other could accomplish, and then different directions the Alliance could go in response to that. And then it took this hard left out of character at the end, which was a little jarring, but I liked the sample Hollowers they suggested, and the fact that we got an instrument and paradigm alongside a merit, a flaw, and a rote. That was useful, at least, I guess. Could have used more, obviously. But I have also met a non-zero number of people with the anarchist braggart flaw, and it's pretty on the nose. What I was really curious about was how they were going to distinguish these from orphans, because I've always felt like that's a tough needle to thread in Mage. And given how heavily this chapter relies on narration than concrete game elements, I thought most of this write-up could have been used for either of those groups. But I'll reserve judgment till we get to the Orphan chapter.
Well, even though they'd like us to, we can't forget the Ahl-i-Batin. This chapter didn't land well for me. The author tries to convince me the origin story of the Ahl-i-Batin is ridiculous. It's not working. I think their origin story is cool. What's not cool is taking the mystical elements out of the game when they've been there for years. We aren't given an appealing replacement either. The framing narrative for the chapter is a Batini mage telling a non-Batini mage all about the craft. This runs counter to the craft's ethos. They are not only secretive, they are the masters of secrecy among mages and don't share their secrets with outsiders. We also learn their internal groups, the Khanates, are gone. The University of Light, the Paradise Garden, all gone. We aren't even told why they were dismantled. I'm not trying to be sarcastic. When reading this chapter, I really felt like I was hearing a New World Order agent disguised as a Batini in order to spread disinformation to other mages. It feels like a psyop, but that's just my point of view. Don't take me seriously. The rotes and merits at the end didn't present me with anything memorable. Pooka, how did this chapter work for you?
All right, buckle up. I've got some words here. I'm going to preface my thoughts with 2 comments. First, I'm not Muslim, and I don't know whether the writer is Muslim, so for any of my uncertainty around religious aspects beyond what I learned in Arabic class, I'll defer to those more knowledgeable. Second, one of my earliest teenage mage moments that crystallized how bonkers the game could be was reading Book of Shadows and the account of the Knight of Fana in there. So while I appreciate that there may have been missteps in the history of the game's presentation of the craft, and they're probably second only to the hollow ones in the amount of ink spilled on them, and the things that need to be rectified, I do feel like I have this little nugget of adoration for the group, and I wanted to see them done right. So this section, here's my thinking, following again on what I said about assuming the reader would only have read M20 Core, maybe Book of Secrets on top of that. It is not great writing practice to directly undercut the facts laid out in the edition's initial write-up, and especially to undercut things in this very chapter. M20 talks about the Knight of Fana as the foundational moment for the craft, and this section goes, it's a ridiculous story invented by our oppressors. M20 talks about Enteleki as a consciousness personified by the Khwaja Al-Akbar. This section is like, nope, that's not what it is, and we don't use symbols or myths to define ourselves, despite them saying a couple pages later that their magic works through symbolism. The narrator dismisses out of hand the idea that they were divided into factions, saying that was to impress the traditions, but then says, we've always been scholars, alchemists, judges, and ascetics, which are 4 very different things, each of which can have a very distinctive approach without being called a faction. They go back and forth on which faiths are party to the web of faith. With all of that and the sort of fast and loose details on time and place, they joined the traditions, then they left. Let's gloss over the 500 years in between. It really felt kind of slapdash. And just as a side note, they replace Enteleki with Intalakin, which, my Arabic is a little rusty, but it means something of the divorce, so I don't know what they were going for there. I also raise an eyebrow with things like directly calling the jinn devils, or in reference to masters of mind magic with sometimes questionable methods saying that Qutb means judge, because that's a well-established term in Sufism for not that. But, like I said, I'm not an expert on the religious side here. Anyway. The second not great writing practice in this section is to constantly bring up these terms and concepts and things like their relations with the Taftani, sneer at uninformed perspectives on them, and then say, but I don't have time to explain further, and by the way, we are cloaked in half-truths. So that's true, there wasn't enough word count for anyone in this book, but all this is going to do is deeply confuse people who are coming at this to learn more about the craft. Maybe that's the narrator's intention, it shouldn't be the writer's, and I was left feeling like the focus on subtlety was being leveraged as an excuse to avoid coherence or detail, which was darn frustrating. Now, retconning the Ahl-i-Batin invented Islam piece, that was a good move. Fleshing out their war against the Nefandi and fleshing out the web of faith, however briefly, those were good moves. We get a heftier spoonful of crunch than most of the other crafts do, despite the muddy presentation of their focus beyond unity and also subtlety. And the moments talking about diaspora, when they peer through, are important for making it feel like you can incorporate this craft into a game. But I came away disappointed because so much space was taken up by, this detailed thing you've heard about us? Well, guess what? It's not true, but I'm not going to give you anything to replace it with. With word count at such a premium in this book, it feels like a waste that one of the richest groups in the game gets so little to work with to make them three-dimensional and presentable within the setting. Rant over.
Now we drift into the Kahu. This is the updated name for the Kopaloe, and I like it. It's easier to remember, to pronounce, to spell. You want to bring new people into the game, give them names they can pronounce. The author made several changes in this craft to try to bring them into the 21st century. I usually don't like this kind of thing, but this time I agree with the author's choices. Previously, the Kahu had retreated into ancient ways. Now, as a group, they realized they couldn't go on like that. Their strict recruiting and training standards have been rethought because they were in danger of dwindling away. They no longer have purity standards for the ethnic background of young mages. They no longer look for young people who are dedicated to ancient customs. They also stopped putting great effort into maintaining secluded places among the Pacific Islands where they can live like they did in ancient times. Their magic is adapting to a modern world, and we see this with routes that not only speed up canoes on the water, but also cars on the highway. This chapter focused on Hawaii and didn't let us see other Pacific islands. It's a shame, but when the author told me it was because of the short page count, I can understand. I'm halfway through Myths and Legends of the Polynesians by Johan C. Anderson, and I'm enjoying it. It provides context for several things you'll find in the Book of Crafts write-up that weren't fleshed out properly. I was disappointed on how little mention there was of relations with the Disparate Alliance. It would have been great to see a few paragraphs describing what the Kahu think of it, how the Alliance is trying to include the Kahu in their projects, things like that. Well, Pooka, did the Kahu make you want to visit the islands?
I just want to visit them, regardless. Your interview, that really helped contextualize a lot of the approach to this chapter. Looking back at Book of Crafts, there was a lot of material to work with, but not all of it useful for bringing forward, from connections with werewolf and changeling to the use of pigeon. It's also great that there are so many terms introduced and immediately translated here, so that you get a feel for the language without getting lost. There were bits that have a through line into the M20 core book write-up, like the sort of muddy line with whether the craft is primarily Polynesian or Hawaiian, their nativism around that, and the whole they don't believe in spheres thing. The write-up here reinvents the group from the ground up in lots of ways, and I think it's good that they're less concerned with genealogical purity as they were before. The text is directly stated to be grounded in Hawaiian culture, but choosing just one was probably necessary given that there are hundreds of Polynesian languages and at least as many associated cultures. The spheres thing was handled beautifully because, sure, you can say they don't have spheres as a concept within their own group, but the core book saying that they didn't have an affinity sphere, that puts them at a disadvantage to other mages, so I'm glad that was handled gracefully. And the restructuring of the craft that we get here makes sense to me too. The in-character front half of the section adds more nuance to their ethos than we've seen before. There's clear attention to the balance between the traditional and the modern in a way that felt natural, and how that informs what the mages are up to. So that's what you need for integrating them into a game. There were questions around things like the environment, tourism, the government, and each is presented with different paths forward. And I remember in the interview, you had asked the author why the Disparate Alliance itself was so rarely mentioned in here, and I liked her response that it gives the table freedom to decide how they're going to engage with it. I think that's also true for the social and political and cultural and religious issues that come up here. That approach of, here's what the group cares about, and here are the different types of mages involved gives you a lot to work with without feeling confined. So I'm glad to see there were more words spent on that than like the future glimpses this book seems so invested in. I did find the highlighting of the Avatar storm a bit surprising, since almost everyone seems to have cast that piece of the metaplot away, and maybe I would have liked a little more detail on how the elements of their focus reflect their culture. But the fact that we got a section that divided up paradigms, practices, and instruments at all was pleasantly surprising. On top of that, there are multiple merit and flaw ideas and useful rotes. The 3 character concepts make sense and have good story hooks built in, so overall, I really liked it.
Well, the Sisters of Hippolita are up next. Hippolita was an agreeable dinner date in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, but her descendant on page 217 of the Mage 20 rulebook looks rather unfriendly. The author of this chapter gave them a more reasoned, approachable demeanor. As an insensitive Western man, I shouldn't be commenting on this group, but I will say I appreciate this approach. This chapter attempts to link the description from the Book of Crafts with the new version presented in Mage 20. They were a small group in one place in Greece until 1922. They were attacked and decided it was time to spread out, both for safety and to better accomplish their goals. They now have larger conclaves in Greece, France, Colorado, and British Columbia. There's a mention of large conclaves that are no more, and there's some mystery around there. You can construct some story hooks if you like. They have smaller groups in other places. The Colorado conclave is the largest and most influential. The Greece conclave is the most respected, and it is where the oldest and most conservative members have the privilege to reside. The fact that they cause less trouble when they are lumped together in one place and highly praised has nothing to do with the decision, I'm sure. The Greece conclave Conclave was on an island in 2nd edition. Now it moved to a spot deep in the mountains of Thessaly after the 1922 attack. The rote Break the Bonds uses spirit to do a matter effect. I'm not down with that. This chapter set a good tone. It bridged the gap between 2nd edition and Mage 20. We better understand how an international Sisters of Hippolita operates. It made the craft appear more approachable. I was never a big fan of this craft, but then I'm an ignorant man. How could I ever understand them? Pooka, I would ask you what you thought of this chapter, but you liked it so much you interviewed the author. Give us your thoughts.
So I hadn't actually read the old Book of Crafts write-up before, and I was amazed at how much the Sisters changed between editions. Like, there are some common threads, like the focus on community and the structure of conclaves and whatnot, but there's this fundamental shift where 2nd edition presents them as being mostly self-isolating and almost pacifist unless pushed. The M20 core book splash image, on the other hand, is a protester with her fist raised as a tear gas canister goes off at her feet, and the write-up echoes that vibe. When I spoke with the author about this section, she described them in a nutshell as social justice witches. And really, this version of the Sisters had maybe the least amount of material to work with out of all these groups, even less than the Ngoma. So bearing that in mind, I also appreciated how this section took the time to lay out in character how the craft got from point A to point B. They point to the changing realities of the 21st century for their shift in attitudes around gender, the nature of their activism, and their overall goals. It sort of echoed the evolution from 2nd wave to 3rd wave feminism for me. In Book of Crafts, they are really focused on things like childbirth and ritual spaces for groups of women. And in this book, they have moved past that to be focused on substantive change among sleepers, with a focus on prizing the individual and her own expression of the feminine. And that generational tension is kind of underscored by the note about the elders at the conclave in Greece versus elsewhere, and the bit where the narrator says that talking to the verbena gets real boring at parties. Naturally, I appreciated the deep, academically informed notes that we got about the line between myth and history. So overall, it's building off the new foundation we got in the core book, but bringing back in bits and pieces of their old presentation, which gives players and STs some room to find variation within the craft that can fit their game. And I thought it was neat that we got details about 2 of their key celebrations, which is something novel on top of the focus notes and the rotes. Maybe my biggest issue is that their goals are so focused that in order for them to make sense in a game, unless you're incorporating a storyline where the protection of women is directly relevant, and as I said in that interview episode, I have done that, and I was very happy the group existed so that the story worked within the mage setting, it's going to be tough to explain why a sister is working with non-sister mages. Even some other disparates are kind of suspect in their eyes. Their attitude seems to be, changing times demand we find allies somewhere, and the traditions and technocracy are both awful, so let's tentatively try this new alliance. And to roleplay that effectively across a range of stories, I feel like you need an all-sisters game, or have the craft's response to a character who's bucking the trend be a major part of that character's story. They may want to work with others more now, but they don't seem quite at the point where it's easy or makes total sense.
Here be dragons. Yes, the Wulong are next. The opening fiction for this chapter is the best in the book. There's action. We see what the mages of this faction actually do. There's a supernatural element. From there, we begin a different look at the Wulong. Very different. The origin of the Wulong is retconned to be an all-women group in ancient times. In the 3rd century BC, when the Wulong became mostly men, they were evil and bad. Could the author have a bias? Nah. After finishing the history section, I thought of all the crafts, the Wulong are one of the most suited to a fascinating shadow history. But we don't see that. We just get real-world history, nothing more. There are now 2 internal groups. Yellow dragons are the young, Azure dragons are the old people. This started in 2014. The author makes it clear the young members are good, the old members are bad. If this sounds simplistic, how dare you? Just how dare you? The Dragon School, Tiger School, and Phoenix School are either no more, or they are tiny remnants of their former selves inside the Azure Dragons. The Wulong recognize 5 areas of magic: Qian, which is spellcasting and martial arts; medicine and healing; astrology, geomancy, and reading palms, also reading faces. The rotes, merits, and flaws at the end are rather uninspired, nothing really worth mentioning. The info on Chinese faiths and magical instruments is simple and things we already knew. This chapter was a little dull for me. It feels like the author phoned it in. In summary, I really like the Wulong, but after reading this chapter, I'm not sure I like them anymore. Pooka, what were your thoughts?
Get ready, because this is my other rant for this book.
I'm ready.
I also just want to say the opening fiction, well, it's certainly a piece of fiction. just kind of happens. Is it impolite for me to say that it had the rhythm of a children's book? I don't know. Anyway, this chapter was just kind of a mess. Again, going back to the pre-M20 material, there's quite a bit for this craft. They're aloof, they're staunch traditionalists in most senses of the word, and they're regrouping after a downturn in their fortunes. That was epitomized in Dragons of the East by them building bridges with their longtime rivals, the Akashics, in the context of Chinese diaspora. Sorcerer's Crusade companions show them at the height of their power and their pride, which, before the fall and possibly an opium war or two, goeth. Book of Crafts grounds their magic solidly in traditional Chinese metaphysics and Confucian philosophy, especially ancestor veneration, which gives them a solid identity. From those pieces, there are millennia of texts, concepts, and practices to draw on, with more than enough left over for the Akashics, the Wukong, and a few others besides. So, looking at the M20 core book write-up again, I was perplexed. Their pride still comes through, and some bits like the titles and structures of the craft are in there, but in the core book they seem to be obsessed with gold and filled with self-loathing at the modernization they've had to undergo to survive. And then this book takes an even harder left, fixating on the politics of gender, generational, and geopolitical conflict. Because if there's a mage game I want to play, it's how the tension between Gen Z and boomers bears out. Their words. And I get the desire to modernize these crafts, both for its own sake and to fit the M20 vibe, but this just wasn't clicking with me at all. It might be partially the balance of the words that did it. We get a full page on their origins in the early dynasties of China, mainly around the wizards in the context of patriarchy, and we get 2 full pages on the turmoil of the 20th century, especially on how leftists among the wizards managed, and then we get 2 sentences, charitably, on the 2,000 years of really important history in between. We get a full page on the contemporary generational conflict, and apart from one brief mention, we get nothing about the group outside of Hong Kong and a little bit about Taiwan. Diaspora, also really important, and not in here. And on the subject of what's important, there's a sidebar in the book that lays out in detail the particulars of transliterating Chinese, which is great, except that throughout the section, when they use pinyin, they left out the tones entirely, and I, as a linguist, turned to literal dust. I'll also mention the splash image they get on page 83. Whatever image I had of the Wulong before this, body-stocking ninja lady holding a Molotov cocktail mid-crane pose was not it. But maybe that art tells you all you need to know about the direction they seem to want to take here. To be clear, I'm not opposed to changing and updating these groups when necessary, and I am not the person to comment on Chinese representation in the game, but I'm certain that there was much that needed changing and updating. The political situation in Hong Kong is certainly a timely issue for the craft to have an opinion on, but it felt like the in-character narrator was almost making a meta-commentary about the game's own relationship to specific issues at the expense of usable material. There's basically nothing new and detailed enough to help you use them in any game that isn't the Azure Dragon versus Yellow Dragon thing. And that itself feels like an in-game excuse for ditching the extensive leadership structure and schools of magic that they had. So now they can just say, oh, the Yellow Dragons are democratic, instead of, we don't have the word count to explain, much as in the Ahl-i-Batin chapter. The complicated backgrounds of the character concepts all felt pointed towards justifying the feel of this section, and in the balance of all of that, we get one confusing paragraph on their approach to magic, hardly anything about their opinions of other mage groups, some painfully under-detailed rotes. This was a letdown, I'll admit. The Peachwood swords were cool, at least.
The Bata are next. They started on the Caribbean islands, but now they have spread out. If Gilligan and the crew of the Minnow had shipwrecked on a Bata island, that would have been an interesting show. But enough about 60s television. The proper pronunciation of the Bata is uncertain. Sateros Bricado pronounces it Bata. When I interviewed the author of this chapter, he said Bata. Listeners can email us to help us with the correct one. This chapter is hard to assess. I liked the energy. I liked the metaphors. Some of the decisions seemed odd to me. A Book of Crafts presented a group that grew out of a fusion of 7 African tribes, Caribbean natives, and Spanish Catholicism. This chapter depicts a decidedly African character. The signature character tells us about the Bata. He is a DJ, so he uses music as a metaphor for their magic. Music is subjective. To make it, you blend styles, genres, and other things on an instinctual level, not following directions from a book. This metaphor worked for me. Each member of the craft is, in a sense, a musician, not a technician. There is a big focus on social justice and current events, which isn't my favorite when covering mage factions. There are 7 clans named after tribes of the African diaspora. Each clan has a specialty. New recruits are trained by one of these clans and always considered one of theirs. There is very little mention of the Disparate Alliance. Specifics on how they interact with the larger faction would have been great. Both the Ngoma and this chapter state the two crafts love each other and get along great. I have a hard time seeing this. The origin points in Africa are distant, the magic styles are quite different, and the overall personalities of the two crafts are nearly opposite. I can see them getting along with the Taftani or Kahu more than Noma. Loco's Palm is a potent healing rote. The problem is the stamina points you sacrifice are regained a little too easily, in my opinion. Several fans on our Discord server said the chapter feels too North American. I see it too. They make a good point. Ricardo recommended a Brazilian movie called Besouro. In North America, its name is The Assailant. It's about some guys who get mad and kick each other, but they use capoeira, so it's cool. Excellent inspiration for a Bata character. Pooka, what was your take on this chapter?
I'll say up front that I adore the writing style of the first half, quite possibly my favorite in the whole book. But I know that I'm also atypical in the kinds of writing style I like in a book. When we did Lore of the Traditions and I was super into the Dream Speaker / Kavadi chapter, I get the impression that's not the usual reception. But the conceit of the podcast and the mixtape here, the voice of the narrator, the connections laid out, I found all of it excellent. However, I do acknowledge that if this had been the first chapter I read, I might have been left a little bit adrift, because the other sections are mostly organized along a visible template, what I imagine was the brief for the book. And this one kind of confounds that order in what I think of as a very Bata fashion, moving between the past and the present, their motivations grounded in racial justice, discussed alongside the ways they manifest their magic. All of it kind of back and forth with bits of repetition, like a refrain in a song. And that connects to something I remember the author talking about in your interview, hip-hop as this guiding principle, or as this section says, hip-hop saved the Bata. From the perspective of their magic, I almost see an interesting counterpoint to the Hollow Ones, in how it's described as remixing and remastering the ancient faiths and regional magics. But while the Hollowers do that purely on, aesthetic and vibes, the Bata have done it out of necessity and shared strength. And hip-hop does much the same thing, drawing together different strands of culture, turning them into something new. So that sort of structured transformation done with intention is what defines their style to me, more than the details of spirit riding, offerings to the Loas, etc. From a meta point of view, the section does the same thing to previous write-ups of the Bata, picking and choosing and recontextualizing older editions into this new approach. It is helpful to have some more game-grounded details about those things in the back half of the section. So the Monteachual piece and the instruments are more extensively detailed, I think, than any other individual pieces of a magical style than we get elsewhere in the book. I was a little disappointed we only got the one rote, and the one piece I was unsure about was the alignment between the 7 clans and 7 of the spheres. I'm assuming in game terms this might just be for picking an affinity sphere, but is membership determined by actual ancestry in some way? And how much do the clans educate each other about their arts? Do none of them use matter or time much? It's an interesting concept, and I like how each has their own specialized instrument, but it opened a lot of questions for me without providing answers. Overall, though, the criticisms you mention are valid, but I still found the entire chapter to be excellent. Might even be my favorite in the book. I also loved how they had zero patience for the Templars.
Well, next we'll try to decipher the Solificati. They are Western alchemists. In Book of Crafts, they were independent and in the process of separating into 2 groups, the Old Guard and the younger people who preferred the name Children of Knowledge. In this chapter, the Old Guard has found a place inside the Order of Hermes, while the young people are in the Disparate Alliance and want to be called Solificati. Their separation has reached the point where there is probably no more communication. The Wulong, the Ngoma, the Solificati, lots of crafts found a home in the Order of Hermes. I'll bet the Hermetics have a craft night events. Everyone bring your regional dishes. I wish they'd invite me. Anyways, the Solificati love symbolism, allegory, mystery. The point of view character tells us about the craft with a lot of snarky attitude. Normally, I'd find that off-putting, but considering the craft, I actually thought it worked here. The history section is so short, it's a blur. It is peppered with names and terms that can easily be used for web searches, so although brief, I thought it was cleverly executed. The section on Halel Teomim talks of symbols and sacrifices. Hallel was a signature character that started in the 90s. Male and female members of the Solificati combined to form a single mage who was a member of the First Cabal soon after the Council of Nine formed in the 1400s. The First Cabal's tragic end led to the Solificati leaving the Council of Nine soon after they joined. This section fails to mention Hallel betrayed the other members of the First Cabal to enemies who killed them. Comparing Hallel to Jesus Christ was wild. Hallel was punished for crimes he actually committed. I thought the rotes section was too simple. The rotes are such basic applications of magic that I was disappointed. We learned the Solificati get along well with ecstatics and etherites. This makes sense to me. I see them getting along well with the hollow ones too. Revised edition came down hard on life extension magic. Now it's okay again. In fact, it's easier than second edition. Pooka, esoteric stuff is so simple for you. Can you speak to this chapter?
I can speak in metaphors. No, I'll try to be more direct. I hadn't known much about the Children of Knowledge and their modern expression before going into this. As a Sorcerer's Crusade fan, I knew about the Solificati and their original incarnation, and the specter of Hallel looms large over the metaplot throughout the game, and alchemy is easy to grab onto as a concept for Mage, so all of that was central to my understanding, particularly because the Club-Kid Mage archetype is something that I would more associate with Cult of Ecstasy. So, reviewing the Book of Crafts and the core book material, the highlighting of LSD and alchemy as a metaphor, I'm on board with the concept overall. I just wanted to see how those two rather different buckets of ideas were done justice here. And furthermore, by this point in the read-through, how they were going to fit into the Disparate Alliance program of social justice and mutual aid. As I pointed out earlier, the children were initially listed as one of the foundational crafts in the Alliance, so I was perplexed by their outsider status. Yes, they've all been tarred by that Hallel brush, but if anyone wouldn't care so much about that, it's presumably other crafts. That said, as you pointed out, the narrator seemed pretty okay with Hallel's betrayal, so make of that what you will. What made more sense to me was framing it with the everything is temporary principle that guides them. And the section does lay out pretty clearly how they engage with other groups. They're the money for the Alliance, they have a kind of détente with the ecstatics and the etherites, and the fissure between them and the old guard who joined the Hermetics has not been repaired. So that's one revised era folding of a craft into a tradition that seems not to have been retconned. The narrative voice doesn't always make it easy to tease those threads out, though, because between the use of nicknames like the Gandalfs and the frequent name or concept dropping from throughout the Mage canon, you can tell this was written by Satyros, because the mix of very dense references and allusions with some extensive philosophizing on the nature of magic mixed in is very much what I think of as his style. There is some of that mentioning things then abandoning them because of word count issue that we saw in previous chapters, but it's more about the practice of alchemy in general rather than the details of the group in game. And as you pointed out, one can do research elsewhere on the topic to flesh things out. I don't mind that personally, but it might be tough for a new player to get into it. The crunchy stuff at the end is easier for a new player to latch onto. For better or for worse, Satyros has a lot to point to in the core book and its overflow material, and does so liberally when getting into the children's focus elements and rotes. There's 2 solid pages of material to use, whether or not you like it. That structure will be familiar to someone raised primarily on M20, and overall, they're an easy enough group to conceptualize, though maybe I'm just saying that as a former raver. But they're a difficult one to explore to their fullest depth because alchemy and its meanings across the world and history is so huge. I think a bit more about how their interpretation of that practice compared with other mage groups might have been interesting, and I would have liked to see how they actualize and embody alchemy in more non-standard ways. But overall, it hangs together as a solid write-up, more or less.
Well, I almost forgot the Orphan chapter. I think they're used to it. Chapters in Mage books on orphans have always been weird for me. How many paragraphs does it take to say, individuals vary, they do their own thing? My favorite example of orphan material was in Book of Shadows. We see an orphan who runs an occult bookstore. It's an example of a mage on the fringe of regular mage society, but still a part of it. The chapter in today's book just didn't stick the landing for me. I didn't find it helpful. I think its word count should have been divided up among the previous chapters. We get 8 pages of general advice to be careful. The rotes were too simple to be appealing. More on how orphans reach out to other orphans would have been nice. Some material on orphan groups would have been great, but the authors were probably afraid it would detract from the Disparate Alliance. Pooka, what was your take on this chapter?
Can I just ask, is the Orphan Book of Shadows, the bookstore owner, is that the one who makes a big deal about hooking up with a verbena on Christmas? Because that's what I remember from that story.
I don't remember that detail. You
Yes,
got me
yeah,
flat-footed. I'd have to look that one up.
We may have divergent viewpoints on this chapter because... So the thing is, because an overt Ascension War metaplot isn't something that particularly interests me, orphans are almost the default form of mage in my usual take on the setting. Those who awaken under the auspices of an established group are the exception rather than the rule in my headcanon, and those who come to a group later are the lucky ones, debatably. But the orphan identity is one that I find frees up some headspace to think more carefully about the personal nature of magic, the way a practice is built, and to look at how indoctrination slowly takes hold, which are all questions that interest me more than what are the Hermetics doing in this corner of the world, or what's the fanciest stuff this level of the Requisitions background can get me. Against the backdrop of the standard setting, though, the orphans kind of have to be bitter and or antisocial to maintain their independence, which just bugs me. It's been a minute since I flipped through the Orphan Survival Guide to see if there's a more useful way to thread that needle, but if memory serves, not really. So all of that was under the surface as I went into this chapter, and really what this part benefits from is that there's not a history for the orphans per se to go through, or a bespoke magical style to explain. The section here titled Orphan Survival Guide is useful to me because it gives tips on how to play a character. So I don't necessarily want all of these mages to gravitate around life on the lamb and or a shoestring, but instead of a discrete group presented like a craft, I'd almost rather there be a spectrum from entirely involved in a tradition to not involved at all. The advice being delivered in character here, though, it's just great advice for a low-powered character in any street-level game, if you're into that kind of thing. I think the hardest piece is figuring out how to integrate them into a group, even if you're running an all-disparates game. The frenemies section reinforces that they don't really form lasting connections easily, even with each other, and the storyteller advice in that direction would have complemented the character-building stuff well. Speaking of character building, I loved the 3 sample characters we got here. All of them have built-in story hooks. The rotes, I at least liked that they didn't require several spheres or high-level spheres, which is useful for the games that I run. The one big piece that I thought this section could have benefited from was a deeper dive into their magic beyond, they're scrappy and they use more technomancy than you'd expect. I understand not wanting to make ironclad statements because they are so individualistic, but there's zero information about what a given paradigm might look like to them, or details of gutter magic, or how they associate and teach each other here and there without having a formal structure or banding together into like-minded groups. It's kind of the flip side of repurposing the template for these write-ups. You get a wealth of stuff for role-playing the character, but little for role-playing their magic. I guess the introfiction was meant to do that a little, but I could take or leave the introfiction, and I think the original Orphan Survival Guide maybe handled some of those aspects better. In any case, I liked this one better than I thought I would. Not perfect, definitely not the kind of thing all mage players will be into, but it worked well enough for me.
We turn now to general thoughts on the book as a whole. This is the last installment of Tomes of Magic for me, so I'll share some thoughts on Mage 20 as well. After 4 interviews with authors for this book, a notion that kept popping up was doing it right. Several times I heard people say, as a player or storyteller, if you can't portray a craft right, it's better not to bring it into your game. I can understand the desire to be respectful of real-world groups of people, but I disagree. We shouldn't be afraid of experimenting and exploring in our games. I don't think you have to do careful research to make a craft character or NPC for your game. As long as we aren't trying to make fun of them, we should be free to sample other cultures, other viewpoints in our roleplay sessions. After a good game, you're more motivated to research the culture. Before a game, you're just entertaining ideas. You may not be ready to dive into research. The 9 traditions of the original game were nice because they weren't tied to specific nations or ethnic groups. The crafts are mostly joined at the hip to very specific real-world groups of people. When considering this book, it's natural to take a look at Book of Crafts from 2nd edition, but the difference you'll find is an issue of magnitude. Let me explain. The 1996 book from 2nd edition offered smaller, less powerful factions that hid away in corners of their own. The idea was that book spread out a map of the globe and said, there are cool groups of mages out there. If you take a trip, you can meet them. Games would focus on bringing in one craft at a time, and players could decide if they were opponents, allies, whatever. Revised edition spread them to the whole world against their will. Mage 20 treats them as full top-flight factions. They are global, larger, more powerful than they were before. There's an assumption the average craft could go toe-to-toe with the average tradition from the Council of Nine. As long as you understand that difference, you can look in both books for ideas. I came to this book wanting to hear about the Disparate Alliance as a faction. What projects have they started? How are they going? What problems came up as a result? That's what I wanted to hear. This book focuses on the 10 crafts instead. Early editions of Mage made it clear the Council of Nine was succeeding because mixed tradition cabals were a thing. Are mixed craft cabals a thing in the Disparate Alliance? I don't know. After reading the book, I don't think so. The chapters on Ngoma, Taftani, and Kahu were surprisingly good. There's a saying, if a World of Darkness splat book makes you want to bring that group into your game, the book was a success. However, the Ahl-i-Batin, Wulong, and Orphan chapters were not. The developer or editor should have called rewrites on those chapters, or at least a discussion. The book has a device of describing possible futures viewed by members of the craft with the time sphere. These are supposed to be ideas for games. I found them too vague and general to be helpful. Mage 20 books have a maddening habit of ignoring the risks of modern technology. They want to portray every mage as living like sleepers. They all use modern devices, apps, the internet, etc. They ignore the fact that using a device, network, or service you don't understand well has risks. The technocracy could be spying on them or even manipulating them. Mages should acknowledge that possibility. This book, like most Mage books after 2000, defines Ascension as making the world a better place. I prefer the original meaning, which was raising your arete so high you gained a fundamental understanding of the way the universe functions. This book makes repeated statements about how awful and stuck up the traditions are. When you read Lore of the Traditions, I don't see it. In fact, the values and character of the traditions fit so well with the crafts that I don't see why they don't get along great. After reading the two books, I think the Disparate Alliance and the Council of Nine should be besties. Do you need this book? If you're going to use the Disparate Alliance in your games, I recommend it because several of the chapters help you translate the craft from the second edition local version to the new global version. If you want more material on your favorite craft, we offer our commentary to help you make the decision. Pooka, what are your thoughts on the book as a whole?
Well, I would echo a lot of what you said. I'll just briefly add, I think in conclusion, my statement about this book is it's a fair amount of interesting material, unevenly distributed, more or less following a template that didn't give enough word count and sometimes led to words spent on what I see as unnecessary detours, all of which didn't really justify this new faction for the game. And those structural issues echo, I think, my overall problem with Lore of the Traditions. The amount of space each writer had to work with was never going to be adequate, but they could have done better with the economy of words. The fact that there were 3 full levels of stretch goal for this book, I'm baffled at how short it is, and knowing that there was something from the IP holder is helpful to kind of understand that, but still. I don't know if more words would have been good. If they followed the route of Lore of the Traditions, we probably just would have gotten notable NPCs with stat blocks or something. But I don't think it could have hurt, and maybe would have opened up some more space for making each of these crafts more three-dimensional. It often suffered from telling rather than showing, and sometimes it's hard to squeeze out the more nuanced themes of the game, like personal hubris and the personal struggle towards ascension. So maybe I'm asking too much. I think that my favorites are probably the Taftani, the Kahu, and the Bata, and the Ahl-i-Batin, the Wulong, and what's my other least favorite? I'll stick with those two as my least favorites. And yeah, until further notice, this is it. This is the final official comment on Mage for now. So I really wanted this book to mean something more, and in the balance, yeah, I was a little bit disappointed.
There is good and there is bad in this book, and the good is good enough that I'm glad I bought a hard copy to put on my shelf at my own expense. The podcast doesn't pay for that. But because I backed a Kickstarter, I got the PDF for free. So yeah, that's nice for doing text searches. But we have some listener questions, and most of them we thoughtlessly ignored because that's the kind of guys we are. But 4 of them filtered through somehow. Pooka, what do we have here?
Well, we'll start with a question from Drawn Cap. What craft did you find most interesting, and how would you use them in a game?
Well, what's your answer to that one, Pooka?
I think the ones that hit the sweet spot for me of who I find interesting conceptually and who I could use in a game based on their write-up here solely are the Taftani, most likely as aggravatingly well-connected tricksters or vulgar magic rabble-rousers for players to deal with. I could see using almost any of the crafts in principle based on the particular needs of a game, but some of the write-ups in here give a lot more to build on than others. Maybe I'm drawing on my previous knowledge a little bit to say the Taftani, but how about you?
Oh, it's so tempting. I agree. Taftani are great. And after reading this chapter in this book, I probably like them a little more than I did before. But my answer to this is based on the write-ups in this book. I'd choose the Ngoma. I would have Ngoma NPCs approach the player's cabal or chantry with offers to join a new project to oppose the technocracy in a clever, non-violent way. The players would find numerous opportunities, but also risks in the new venture. And as using the Ngoma as NPCs, I think that would be an interesting way to show how they're different from other mage factions, how they can bring something to a game that's harder for other factions to bring in. So I think it, for me at least, it showcases their uniqueness. So I like that one. But did Drawn Cap have another question for us?
Indeed. So, what do you think a disparate craft game would look like to you? What themes and ideas would be explored in such a game?
Oh, I want to jump on that one. There is more than one way to interpret this question. I'm guessing Drawn Cap meant a game where every player has a mage in the Disparate Alliance. There are many directions to take such a game. I'll describe my first impression. If your game focuses on the Disparate Alliance, that means politics and political stories. You want to give the players influence so they don't feel pushed around. The players talk their own crafts into letting them use resources for the Alliance's current project, gathering information on the technocracy in the player's city. The players soon learn the Alliance has two unofficial power structures: the official representatives who meet at council, and active groups like the players. If the players threaten to stop working on Alliance projects, the Alliance backs off and offers them stuff. The players meet other active cabals and realize they have more pull than they should in Alliance decisions. As the players learn more about the technocracy, they see the way the technocracy is organizing large systems with lots of resources that marauders and Nefandi take advantage of when no one is looking. It looks like things may even be planned this way. Players develop allies in the traditions and come to see the tradition mages aren't as bad as they were told. Their new relationships help them win victories, which make them more influential in the Disparate Alliance. Trust and cooperation is better than being insular would be a theme. Well, that was just my initial impression. But Pooka, what did you have for this question?
I think I'm going to have to steal some of those because your initial impression, I think, was more fruitful than my deep thoughts about it. So I would say what the game would look like to me, probably, and yeah, I'm also taking the point of view that this is a game where all the players are members of crafts that are part of the Alliance. So probably deep suspicion of both the traditions that the technocracy would be in there, more of a focus on local and temporal issues rather than philosophical or esoteric umbral ones, and striking a balance between building towards the future and just lots of bickering. I think the book wants you to follow social justice as a theme, but maybe the more salient piece of that is the theme of overcoming differences or not in the name of cooperation. With the exception of an all orphans game, because I enjoy the idea of running one of those. The more interesting case to me might be mixing disparates and traditions together, because then the hash out your issues in order to survive angle becomes even more significant. Alliance members could call out the traditionalists on their hypocrisy, and as the crafts seem to be more invested in sleeper needs, they might hold the tradition's feet to the fire about what it is they're fighting for. And all of that is why more information on the Alliance as a whole and a storytelling chapter overall would have been useful as a framing, rather than the metaplot notes that we get in this book, the options.
So there was another question from Nyx Queen. Two more questions.
Two more questions, yes. First up, Nyx Queen asks, what do you think about the soft removal of the named crafts who were once considered possible members of the Disparate Alliance? And to clarify here, it's in M20. They provide a whole list that says these might join someday, and those are among the ones who we were told did not.
I think the explanations in the intro for why they aren't in the Disparate Alliance make sense. When I was reading the introduction for this book, it gives the impression that the members of the Disparate Alliance got together and said, what about those other crafts? And then one by one, they're like, no, we don't want them, and we don't want them, and we don't want them. And yeah, I guess the explanations mostly make sense. My only objection is the Itsutsugama. The author basically said, I don't like them, so they're out of the game. That felt artificial, and it limited possibilities. But what was your take?
Yeah, their absence makes me a little bit sad, but I understand why they felt they had to pick and choose. The way they explained it, some of them made more sense to me than others. I mean, there's nothing preventing a storyteller from introducing the Itzat or Navalan or even the Hamkas Sobek, who don't even get a mention. But with the official word being nope, it adds more work for a storyteller to try to reintroduce them. Like if you do want to apply the golden rule and say, no, actually this craft that didn't get a write-up would join, it's tough to do that when it's just a flat-out denial.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, it seems like the book is really trying to guide storytellers' decisions here, which may not be always for the best. But what's the next question?
So Nick's Queen also asks, if each craft was given a longer write-up or more word count, what would you add, what would you want focused in on, or wanted explored more? I've got thoughts.
Yeah, let's hear them.
So in the aggregate, almost all of the write-ups are lacking something that one of the other write-ups has. At a minimum, I would want each craft to have a cogent description of their capital F focus with some framing along the lines of M20 core, so the sample paradigms, practices, etc., to help new players connect the two. All of them would have at least a few rotes that clearly showcase how the group conceives of and approaches magic, at least one wonder and one unique thing, be it a typical familiar or a certain magical quirk or whatever. Those would also be good. In most cases, the role of the craft within the Disparate Alliance could have been extended beyond just how they feel vaguely about the Alliance and who they get along with. If that's supposed to be the driving idea behind the book, all of them, I think, could have used more about that. Some of the crafts needed a lexicon section for sure. And one thing from Book of Crafts that I really wish they had brought in here are sample story hooks. That would have been great here. Instead, we get these visions of alternate timelines. I would have much rather had, here are 3 ways to use the craft in your game. I could probably think of more, but I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, if I was wearing the developer hat and more word count was added, I would ask each author to give names for interesting NPCs of the craft, along with what help those NPCs would request from the players, or why everyone is talking about these NPCs. I would also want to hear 3 projects the craft is currently working on and why. Are they going well? Are they going poorly? Details around that. That is a specific kind of a thing that can really help storytellers with plot hooks, with story ideas. Yeah, generally, why would a craft be working on this project instead of something else, and how is it different from the project another craft is working on? It would give character and focus to the crafts at the same time, and I would just love to see that. Well, that hits out our 4 questions. Thank you so much, listeners. We actually went through a lot of different listener questions, and we saw some are answered by anyone who might read the book, and some are well understood by a lot of people anyways, but there were a number of questions that sort of overlapped, and so we sort of boiled it down to the 4 that we thought really focused in on things. So thanks, everyone, for the listener questions, and we look forward to chatting with you all on Discord to hear what you thought of this episode and what we might offer you in the future. But with that, I think we're ready to wrap up, unless you had any other ideas, Pooka?
No, I just want to encourage people to keep it crafty and keep it disparate.
If you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too, and if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in their searches. You can follow us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, and Threads. The links are in the show notes. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there and see the complete show notes. We have a YouTube channel now where you can find our episodes. There's a link in the show notes, but you can also search YouTube for Mage the Podcast. You'll find us. This episode was assisted greatly by our executive producers, and I want to thank them now. Oracle Derek Semsick, Oracle Jason Vines, Oracle Drawncap, Oracle Ben Bandelo, Oracle Sean Gallagher, Oracle The Crew of Erebus, Oracle Christopher Phillips, Oracle Guy Stewart, Oracle Buck Gregory, Oracle Bad Company, Oracle Spartacus, Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Berto, Archmaster Brad of the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Jeff Waugh, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aaron, Archmaster Simon Strand, Archmaster Wolf Larrison, Drunk Des, Jade Barrett, Maurice Hopkins, James B., Jervis Johnson, EBG, George Lara, Will Vincent, Sharton, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Lauren Jensen, Rebecca Poole, Tyler Bryan, Jason Duncan, Sev Nessus, Bubba the Pale One, Henry Kraft, Eric Schwenk, Starfish, Ambiversion, Ryan Stray, Lulz and Stuff, Kathleen Halpern, Kelrick, Alexia, Patrick McNamara, Blaze Hibbert, Rachel Grace, Daniel Scribner, Ricardo, Rob H., Ryan, Alex, Nikita Klaimanov, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Anders S., Bryce Perry, Michael Parker, Jeremy Z., Melissa Krause, Ian Robertson, Curtis Hendricks, That's Real Neato, Sig, Manuel Canos, Darren Hennessy, Eli Levenger, David Rowe, Jason Kennedy, Samuel Tobin, Nibero, Jenna F., Chris Kinner, Gray Trilog H., Daniel Cuppen, Ryan Kendi, Ia Bull, and Stephen Carton. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.